If you want to see how I got to this bare block on this Ford FE360, and you want to know exactly what took this engine off the road 26 years ago, stick around, because on today's episode of Cody Builds, we're going to find out. All right, I'm going to be real with you guys. I spent 6 hours in the shop tearing down the block of this engine, and I recorded a whole lot of video, but I didn't get a lick of audio. So here's what we're going to do. On this week's episode of Cody Builds, I'm going to walk you through step by step exactly what I did to tear this block down and exactly what I found in the block as we were tearing this thing apart. The first thing I needed to do was to disconnect the 4-speed transmission from the back of the block. That started out by taking the 4 bolts out of the back of the transmission that were into the bell housing. I got those bolts out pretty easy. Next up, I had to go ahead and take out some of the exhaust flange bolts that were still there from where we had cut the exhaust off. Those, shockingly, those came out without any issues. Once the transmission was loose, and let me tell you, that thing weighs 1,000 pounds. It is so heavy. But once that transmission was out of the way, it was time to get the bell housing off. So I pulled the dust cover off the bell housing and removed the bolts off of the bell housing and got that out of the way as well. This bell housing is the stock bell housing and it's cast. So this will not be going back on the truck when we put the new transmission in. I will be going with a scatter shield, something that's SFI approved, so down the line, if we decide to take this thing to a drag strip, we'll be fully compliant there. Once the bell housing was off, I had access to the pressure plate to get that off, as well as the clutch discs and the flywheel. Now, shockingly, these were all in pretty good shape as well. I was expecting a lot more wear and tear on the clutch discs as well as the flywheel. They are in pretty good shape. I'm probably gonna hold on to the pressure plate, the flywheel, the clutch disc, and the transmission for now. Maybe sometime down the line, if we pick up a automatic F100, maybe we'll think about doing a manual swap. With the transmission removed, as well as the bell housing and flywheel, it was now time to get the engine block up onto the engine stand. And I know in a lot of my videos lately, I've been harping about how great a lot of these Harbor Freight products are. So I don't want to come off as I'm shilling for Harbor Freight or something like that, but when I have a product that works and it's at a good price, I like to tell you guys about it. This 1,500 pound stand so far has been fantastic. In doing some research, I found that the full weight of the FE block with all the accessories on it probably weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of 650 to 750 pounds. This is a 1,500 pound stand. It didn't even blink an eye, didn't squat or anything once the block was attached and all the weight was being held by the stand. So far, so good. I'm happy with it. Now, there is quite a bit of play on the rotating crank assembly on this thing. I think if I disassembled it and packed it full of grease, that may take up some of that play. But one thing that I would be cautious of is as you're rolling this thing over, if you have a major change in center of gravity, you probably want to go very slow when you're doing that, so that play doesn't allow the engine to rotate too fast and possibly tip the stand over. I don't think that would happen, but it's just something that you might want to be cautious of. Once the engine was up on the stand, I was able to start removing the accessories. Now, the belts were just corroded into the pulleys. They were stuck in there something fierce. But once I got those cut away and I got all of the accessories free from the front of the engine, I was able to put a breaker bar on the front crank pulley and give it a twist. This thing was free. It wasn't stuck in the slightest bit. It didn't hesitate at all. It rolled right over. And it's funny, once I got this thing rolling over, I actually started pumping fuel out of the fuel pump onto the top of the intake. And man, let me tell you, that was some nasty, nasty fuel. It was fully varnished. I think I probably could have sealed my cabinets with that stuff. It was bad. With all the accessories off of the engine, I then turned my attention to removing the valve covers. And this was our first glimpse at what possibly could have gone wrong. So I went ahead, I pulled those valve covers, and I didn't see anything obvious other than this engine probably went long periods of time between oil changes. There was a ton of burnt oil buildup on everything. There was what looked kind of like a carbony type material. That's all burnt oil. So this truck was probably used and abused. It went far too long between oil changes, and this is what happens. You get this buildup of this burnt oil in there, and my guess is, because Dad was saying he was having issues with lifter noise and all these things, my guess is that there's probably some plugged oil passages in this engine. And there's a few more clues that we'll run into as we go down the road that'll point to that same issue. Other than the burnt oil on the valve train, there was not anything too out of the ordinary. I didn't find any loose rocker arms or loose push rods or anything like that. What I did notice was that the 1 and 5 cylinders had, at the very end, the rockers had quite a bit of side to side play in them. And I imagine that could have accounted for some of that valve train noise, but not having too much experience with these FEs, I'm not sure if that's a common thing or not. But that was the only thing I found that I thought maybe could have been causing that valve train noise. At this point, with the valve covers off and the initial inspection of the valve train, I moved on to taking the intake apart. Once I got the intake off of the engine, and that thing is also incredibly heavy, we are going to be making some big time weight savings when we upgrade this engine and the drivetrain. But once that was out of the way, what I did see was some corrosion in the lifter valley around the front and back of the block. Now, this corrosion didn't look like something that's fresh. It looked like something that's probably been sitting in this lifter valley for a little while. It looks like there may have possibly been an intake leak, but the only thing I'm gonna say to that is when I drained the oil was black, there was no water in it. I didn't have any amount of water, it appeared, in that oil. So, you know, I'm kind of torn on whether I truly had an intake leak or not. This truck was parked with the hood down, with the air filter on, so the odds of water getting into the carburetor and down the intake are pretty slim. The exhaust manifold bolts did give me a little bit of trouble. I didn't worry too much about the original heads, so I didn't take my time too much with them. I just put the big impact on and let it eat. I ended up breaking 3 of the studs. Not a big deal. I can still go back and heat those up and get those out. They didn't break flush, so I do have the ability to weld a nut on and try and get those studs out down the line if I want to. So with the exhaust manifold bolts out and the cylinder head bolts out, I went ahead and I pulled the cylinders off of the engine. I got the valley pan out of the way, and now we had our first good look down each cylinder hole, as well as the full view of the lifter valley. Now, I did have water in cylinder number 1, and I'm just gonna warn you guys now, everything I've done has been with the small block Chevy, so the number system on these big block Fords is foreign to me. So number 1 is on the passenger side, all the way to the front of the motor. And instead of all the even cylinders being on one side and the odd on the other, the cylinders are numbered 1 through 4, starting from front to back on the passenger side, and then 5 through 8 on the driver's side, front to back. So cylinder number 1 had water in it. I do not believe that that water is from a head gasket leak or anything like that. There's a few reasons why. Number 1, the cylinder wall is not pitted in the slightest bit. It looks like fresh rust in there. Number 2, I know when we put this drivetrain on the trailer to transport it up here, it did rain the night before and then on the drive up. I believe that's where this water came from. I think water got down the intake into cylinder number 1. This looks like really fresh water and fresh rust, and it is water. Everything else in the block was antifreeze, so that's another sign pointing to that this was just water that got into the intake in that one day between being installed in the truck and being transported to my shop up here. Otherwise, this engine hasn't sat outside at all. That's not really an issue though, because we're gonna be boring this block 30 thousandths over. From there, I went ahead and started pulling the lifters out of the lifter bores. Now, a few of these, like I said, there was corrosion around the top of them. They were a little stubborn. They didn't really want to come out, but I was able to get all but one of them out with a pick set and a pair of pliers. I will say all of them rotated freely in the bores. It was just that little bit of corrosion around the top of the lifter bore that was giving me some problem. Once the lifters were pulled out of the lifter bores, I inspected the bottom side of them. None of them had odd wear. They were all, you know, what you would expect from a high mileage engine. The portion of the lifter that rides on the cam was concave, and that's what you would expect. Those lifters rotate in the bore as the engine's running. If they stop rotating, that's when you develop problems. So the fact that there was even round wear on all of the lifters tells me that they were all at least rotating freely within the engine. I do have one lifter that's stuck in its bore. I'm gonna pop that out once I get the cam out and I get the crankshaft, the rods, and the pistons out. Again, I don't think this lifter was necessarily sticking because it rotates freely in the bore and it does have some freedom of movement up and down as well. I really don't think this was a stuck lifter issue in this engine that was causing all the noise. I really think it was more of an oiling issue. And I have one other piece of evidence that we're going to get to. With the top end removed from this block, I went ahead and drained the oil from the oil pan. And again, like I said, there was no water. It was nice black oil in there. And then I went ahead and drained the balance of the antifreeze out of the block. With all the fluids out of the engine, I rotated the engine upside down and started removing all the oil pan bolts. What I found as I was removing the oil pan bolts was one of those bolts at the very front of the engine was stripped out, and there was just a screw, like a machine screw and nut, like a through screw and a nut attached. So I think that's a clear sign that either my dad or my grandpa had worked on this truck. I got the oil pan off, and the first thing that jumped out at me right away was I noticed the HV designation on the oil pump. This looks like a Melling high volume oil pump. So this is definitely not the factory oil pump. At some point in time, this truck was probably experiencing low oil pressure. Somebody thought the best thing to do was to get in here, put a high volume pump in, and see if that would increase the oil flow. I'm gonna guess that with the lack of oil changes in this thing, there probably is a blocked oil passage somewhere in it. And that probably has more to do with the lack of oiling than the volume of oil that was being pumped through. Now, I have read varying opinions on these FE blocks and the oiling system. I know there are some oiling modifications you can make to these blocks, and we are gonna do that in a future episode. So I think the culmination of all these things is pointing to an oiling issue. You have the high volume oil pump. That tells me that at some point this thing probably had low oil pressure, and the solution was to put a higher volume pump in. Well, the pump might not have been the cause of the issues. It might have been an oiling passage or something else that was plugged up, likely from burnt oil from not changing the oil. If I had to guess, I would say this thing was probably suffering from a little bit of oil starvation. The lifters, the hydraulic lifters, probably weren't pumping up. That's probably where the valve train noise was coming from, a lack of oiling in the top end of the engine. Now, the only concern that I have up to this point is possibly that corrosion around the lifter bores. When I take this block to be machined, I'm gonna be sure to point that out so I can let the machinists know if they need to bore those lifters out and sleeve them. Whatever they need to do to make that right, we're gonna have to do that. Everything else up to this point has looked good. It turns out the block is pretty unmolested other than the high volume pump. The bore is still the stock 4.05 inch bore for the 360 and the 390. The only difference between a 360 and a 390 engine is the crank stroke. So the bore in these cylinders should be exactly the same between a 360 and 390. That means at this point, if we wanted to go find a 390 crank, we could do that. We could throw it directly in this block and have no issues taking this thing from a 360 to 390. However, if we're gonna go that route, we might as well go for broke here, and that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna get a 445 cubic inch stroker kit eventually to drop into this block. The one advantage to me losing all the audio to this video is that I get to come out here and we get to do a little bit more work on this engine and get it a little bit further along than you would have gotten this episode. I still need to get the harmonic balancer, the timing chain cover, the timing chain cam, rods and pistons, and the crank out of this thing. So we're gonna give that a shot tonight. We're gonna go as far as we can, hopefully get this thing stripped down to a bare block and end this episode off. This is totally not the right tool for this, but we're gonna see if we can make this work. I have a harmonic balancer puller. It's not in this shop, it's in my other garage. So what I've got here is just like a bearing puller. And because the driving pin of this is not the appropriate size for a harmonic balancer, I've got the bolt, just a few threads into the crank as something to push off of. Hopefully, if this thing's not too stuck, hopefully it will come out. Let's see. And if this works, it'll be a minor miracle. Oh, hey, it's coming right off. Good. So it wasn't overly stuck on there. So the wrong tool for the right job. All right, pop that right off. Get the Woodruff key. Yeah, why would all the bolts be the same size? That makes no sense. A little persuasion. Yeah, that timing chain's getting pretty stretched out on this thing. I can see it sagging on the bottom pulley here. Oh yeah, look at this. You can see where the timing chain's digging into every sprocket here. Every cog of this timing set. It was definitely due for a new timing set. I'm looking at the cam retainer screws here, and these things have been hammered on. So now I'm starting to wonder if this engine didn't have a full rebuild at some point in time. All right, these bad boys are being a little stubborn, so I'm just gonna go ahead and throw the vice grip on there. See if I can't get them to break free that way. There we go, there's one. These are gonna get replaced. There we go. Both those broke loose. I got one stuck lifter in the valley here, and I'm wondering if that's what's hanging me up. I don't think it is, because the lifter is all the way at the top of the lifter bore. I just can't get it past this corrosion in the valley. But I want to get it out of there just for peace of mind. I think I got it broke free to where I might maybe be able to get a pair of pliers on it. Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, I had it. I had it and I lost it. Mm-hmm. Okay, good deal. That's out of the way now. Yeah, and you can see I'm gonna have some issues, likely issues in the lifter bore. Look how corroded up this lifter was. Not great. The second I get this second journal onto the bearing, it just freezes. It just wedges itself in there. Yikes. Maybe I can turn on this guy and get it to spin. Pull it as it spins. There we go. Oh, woo, doggy, that's tight. And I got right through that one. That one. Okay. Man, that fought me there. All right, finally got this thing out. It was a little stubborn on this bearing journal here. It just didn't want to fit through the initial bearing. But I'm looking at this, I'm looking this thing over, and the cam lobes look okay. They don't look too beat up. There's some odd kind of wear on the edges. Like right here, I don't know if you can see that. Looks like some corrosion and heavy wear there right on that edge. Same here. But the lobes are in decent shape. They're not, you know, it's not a super aggressive cam, so all that looks okay. So I would say the cam was probably okay. Again, we're gonna go with a more aggressive cam profile, but I don't see anything too crazy on the cam. Now remember, like, we've got some like corrosion and stuff on here, but this engine hadn't been turned over in 20 some years, so there's would have bound to be some residual moisture, and that's more likely what all of this corrosion and stuff is from. It's just from sitting for 26 years. The bearing surfaces all look decent. A little scratched up from me fighting it out, but they don't look overly worn or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, cam's in good shape. I don't see anything that would have caused an immediate issue there. The nice feature about this engine stand is this cranking feature. I talked about that a little bit earlier, but this is super handy. You, my other cheap stand, you could turn the engine by hand, but man, this is way more functional. It's kind of nice just cranking this over, and that's all you got to do. Okay, we're gonna get in here. I want to get the oil pump off first, and you can just see how much burnt oil is in the bottom end of this thing. Like, nothing's clean. So it's not a ton of sludge. And I think that was the same in the pan. I've got the oil pan over here. See, there's not a ton of sludge in the pan. But I also know the pan has been off at least once before because we've got stripped holes. So I'm wondering if at some point this block, like I said, I'm still just leaning towards oiling issues. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna knock the oil pump off and take a look at that real quick. We found it. We found the catastrophic failure, and it's a mighty impressive one, I will say. This guy right here is the oil pump shaft. Runs between the distributor and the oil pump. First off, I don't know my FE engines very well, but I don't think it's supposed to be twisted like that. Look down the end of it. You can see how crooked it is. It's crooked. It's twisted. If you look at the end, you can see if I can get it to focus there. That end is broken off clean. So it definitely was an oiling issue. I knew it had to be something with the oiling system. This is way worse. There you go. Look how crooked that thing is. That's like way worse than I was anticipating. I mean, the whole thing's twisted. It's wild. This is like a hex shaft, and it's just like, I don't know. I've never seen anything quite like that before. Okay, so you can see this shaft, it slides down into the oil pump like this, and then the other end would connect up to the distributor. So I'm gonna do a quick little test here, and I'm gonna guess that this oil pump is seized tight. I'm just gonna grab a crescent wrench here and see if I can turn this oil pump by hand. Nope. Nope, that should turn freely, and it does not. So that is exactly what happened. That oil pump seized. The distributor continued to spin, twisted this oil pump shaft until it broke clean off. So bad oil pump took this engine out. And now I'm a little bit curious, so I'm gonna actually pull the bolts off of the top of this oil pump and see what we can see here. Okay, I got it broke free, but it definitely was seized. So if I run this backwards, so I'm running this, oh yeah, it just locks up tight either way you run it. So you kind of get a look at how this works. This shaft turns here, and as it turns, it spins this inner portion around. Let's pop this off real quick and see if there's something jamming it up, because it will start to turn. Okay, and you can just see there's a lot of sludge in there. Not much, but there is a little bit in there. And then let's look inside here. Oh yeah, okay. That's all it took. So look inside this oil pump. Let me get a flashlight. Okay, you look inside this oil pump and you see this black dot right there. Let's see if you can see that down by my fingertip in there. That black dot looks like it's just a piece of sludge that went through and stuck on this side of the pump. And that's all it took to wedge this piece of the pump up against there and not allow it to spin past that. So I'm gonna take just for fun, I'm gonna take a pick and I'm gonna scrape that off and we'll see if we can free this up to where it'll actually spin, because right now what happens is if I back this up here, I can put this in and spin it all the way until I get to that lobe of the pump, and then it sticks because there's not much clearance in these things. And so, guys, this is why oil changes are so important. If your pump picks up any sludge or anything like that, that's it, toast, game over. We are going to replace this oil pump. I'm not going to use this again for obvious reasons, but I am now curious if I can get that piece of the pump cleared out. I'm wondering if we can restore the pump back to full movement again and just be that final confirmation that that is exactly, see all the sludge on there? That's all it was, guys. That's, I mean, that's wild. Wild, wild. Okay, so I got that little piece of sludge cleared off. We're gonna put this back in. Put my shaft back in. Whoops. Look at that. Spins just fine now. That's all it was, guys. A little tiny piece of sludge that got sucked up through the pump, through the screen. Unreal. Okay, we're gonna start knocking off some rod caps. Okay, final confirmation too that this is a 360. So these are factory, looks like these are the factory Ford pistons. I don't see any Ford markings, but it does say 360 on there. So I guess I can't confirm that these are the factory Ford pistons, but we do have the 360 indicator on there. So our kind of final confirmation that this is a 360. The piston actually looks in decent shape. The rings are free on here. As we pop them out, I'll just keep track of them as we go here, and we'll see how they look. Now look, the rod bearings are getting pretty worn out there. You can see we're down into the copper on that. And there's some pretty good grooves in there as well. Okay, I'm gonna keep the main caps in order. I'm gonna set them aside in order here so I don't get those mixed up. You want to make sure that your main caps are going back on the same crank journal that they came off of. Just want to keep that organized. Okay, I'm being very, very careful with this. I'm protecting the gasket surface with a rag here, and I've got a couple oil pan bolts, and I'm just putting very light pressure on these. I screwed the bolts in a couple threads here, and all I'm trying to do is just pop that rear main seal up a little bit. You can see that's starting to work already. So I'm just trying to get this last main cap off back here. Just being very careful not to damage the gasket surface here. There it goes. Felt a good deal of movement there on that one. There she goes. That rear main seal is really holding that in place. Just gonna lift this up out of place. All right, we'll take a look at the bearings here. You can see the very front main bearing is toast. It's down to the copper on that one. There's a pretty good gouge in this one here, but it doesn't look too bad. Same here. Considering we lost the oil pump in this truck, damage could have been a lot worse. It's actually not bad. Bearings all look decent from there back. It's really just the front bearing here. So we probably had some play in the snout of this crank, just judging by how much it's worn and how offset it is. So, I mean, it's kind of up and off to the side here where that's worn down to the copper. So definitely would have been due for main bearings anyways. Everything else looks pretty darn good. I think we're going to be okay. Okay, this is the crank that came out of there. So, little ding in the journal there. Everything else again looks okay. Journals don't actually look too bad. So I'd say this crank is definitely reusable. Could be probably stand to be polished, but if we wanted to go back with the 360 crank, it's there, it's usable. So yeah, I mean, I'm actually pretty shocked for locking up the oil pump. Dad must have been good about as soon as that thing went to zero, he shut her down, didn't run it, and we never started it after he parked it. So definitely saved on the engine. Had we been trying to just fix this thing, we probably could have thrown a new oil pump, oil shaft, and let her eat for a little while. These bearings, that front main bearing looks pretty bad. The rest of them all look pretty good. The rod bearings were actually probably worse off. This thing would have needed a set of rod bearings probably pretty soon. It wouldn't have taken too much more abuse, but that's okay. I mean, there's no major, I'm not seeing any like major issues here. I think we're gonna be in good shape to clean this thing up. So that's next. I'm not gonna do that tonight. That's gonna do it for this episode, but the next step here is going to be to pressure wash this block, strip the rest of the little accessories. I got the dipstick still in there, a couple odds and ends, clean up some of the gasket surfaces, and then we're going to start looking at some oiling modifications. So yes, the oil pump locked up on this, but there are some other modifications we can make to the block itself to improve oiling within this engine. These are tried and true tricks. I picked them up. Actually, I'm gonna let you guys know. Most of the tips I'm getting from this, for this FE build, are coming from Likens Motorsports. Go check his page out. I really enjoyed his videos. They're the inspiration for me doing a 445 cubic inch stroker engine. I believe his name is Brent Likens. He's all over the Ford forums too. I've not talked to him personally, but I'm just throwing it out there. If you want to learn more about Ford powered engines, go check out his YouTube channel. He's got all kinds of super useful information there. So a lot of the tips and things that I'm going to be putting in my videos are coming directly from his videos. Just so you know that, I want to credit him. I'm not an engine builder, he is, so that's the other stipulation I want to make here, guys. I put a couple small blocks together, never done a Ford FE. If you're following what I'm doing, do it at your own risk. Make sure you're doing your own research. Make sure that you're comfortable doing this stuff. You can do it. I can do it. If I can do it, you can do it. But I don't necessarily want you using the engine build as a guide, because I hate for you to follow everything I'm doing to a T and have something horrible go wrong. I can't stress that enough. I'm not an engine builder. I'm going to be building my own engine. I'm comfortable doing that with my own money and my own parts. Keep in mind, I'm an amateur. I'm doing it at my own risk, so just keep that in mind. I think some of you are going to be pretty excited about the build series we've got for that engine coming up. So I just want to be open and honest. I'm trying to be as honest as I can on this channel, guys. Thing is, like I'm telling you guys, I'm not an expert. This is not my day job. I do this for fun. I know you guys are doing this stuff for fun. Don't let this stuff intimidate you. It's just nuts and bolts. Nuts and bolts. You can do it. You can do it. You got to do a little bit of research and make sure you're doing things appropriately. But it's possible. It's not, this stuff's not unobtainable, and that's why I'm making these videos. Like, you guys can get out in your garage with a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of willpower. You can make this stuff happen. So all that said, guys, if you don't work on your project, it will not work on itself. Get out in the garage, get building, and I will see you on the next episode of Cody Builds.